you'll notice that the sum is 9. Now, I entered the numbers 1 through 9, so the sum clearly cannot be 9. It has to be the sum of all these numbers. So let's go back into our code. This is another semantic error, by the way, because it didn't throw any sort of exception, but it didn't give us the result that we necessarily desired. In this case, I'm going to assume the control flow is correct, so I can kind of skip step 1 because we looked at it last time. It does indeed, it definitely prints this out, and then it goes here. So it's going where I want it to go, but the problem is the sum isn't being set right. So our significant variable in this case, that is affecting the outcome. If you'll notice here where we print out the sum, we use the variable sum. So somewhere sum must not be set correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then from there, you either backtrack or run through. So I'm going to backtrack. I'm going to look, where's the last point at which sum was modified? And you'll notice the nice thing about Eclipse is when you double click and select a variable, it'll highlight all the other places in which it's referenced. But I'll backtrack. I'll look, the last time we modified sum was right here. And you'll notice that this says sum equals next. What does that line do? That adds the input from the user, or what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to add the input from the user to the total sum. But right now what this line does is it just sets sum to that input that we obtained from the user. So, and if you weren't entirely sure, of course you could put a system.out.println here, and you could just print out sum every time, and you could even write it in an understandable way so you know what you're printing out. Sometimes that's helpful. We'll just run that again. And you'll notice that each time I do this now, we get sum printed out. But notice that each time nothing's being added to sum. Sum just holds the value of the previous number that we entered, because instead of adding this to sum, I'm setting sum equal to this. So from there, I can go ahead and fix this. And really, I meant for this to be a plus equal. In some programming languages, they don't recognize the plus equal operator, and you'll have to do sum equals next plus sum, and those are two equivalent statements. But let's try this. And now, if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 45. Now, I'm not entirely sure that that's correct, but I'm going to assume that that's correct. I don't want to really go through all these numbers in my head. So if you were actually serious about debugging your program, then yes, you would check whether that's correct. But I know that that works the way it's supposed to. So the next thing to look at, so our program is almost good. The next thing to look at, however, is for some reason it only let me enter 9 numbers, and I wanted it to let me enter 10. Notice I entered the numbers 1 through 9, so if you count that, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 numbers. So another semantic error. Let's once again check the control flow. Now, in this case, the control flow we're looking at is how many times the stuff in this loop, the stuff in this loop is executed. And what determines how many times the stuff inside a loop is executed? Well, this set of statements right here is what determines that. And you'll notice that I start I at 1. I go as long as I is less than 10. And each time I increment I at the end of the loop. So if you go through that in your head, in this case, I'm going to be doing kind of a run through. Once again, let me reiterate that I here cannot be a significant variable. I know I talked about that in an earlier video, because we declare it here, we set it to an initial value, and we mess with it here, or we increment it here. So it definitely exists. This cannot be what's causing our problem. But I may not be setting it correctly. I may not have the right values here. So let's go through this in our head. So if we go through it once, I starts out as 1. We looped once. So I starts out as 1, we execute this code. I is 2, we execute this code. I is 3, we execute this code. I is 4, we execute this code. I is 5, we execute this code. 6, execute the code. 7, execute the code. 8, execute the code. 9, execute the code. 10, we no longer execute the code. This time we break out and go over here. Now, if you go back in this video and count the number of times I said we execute this code, you'll notice I only said it 9 times. So either we have two options. We can make I go from 1 and then make it less than or equal to 10, or the more professional way, which is what people usually do by convention, is we start I as 0 and we go as long as I is less than 10. So if you ever want to execute a for loop a certain number of times, you start I at 0 and then you make I go to make the for loop continue as long as I is less than the number of times you want the for loop to execute. I know this might seem elementary if you've been programming for a while, but I'm trying to gear this towards all levels. So now if we check that, see if that works. Of course, you could also print out the value of I each time. You could put a print statement here, say system dot out dot println, and then you can print the value of I, and then you get an idea of what I is in each run through. Anyway, now I should be able to enter 10 numbers. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, look, I got one more option. Now I can enter 10. And everything looks as intended. So far so good. However, we'd like to test every possible input that produces a different result in that program. So far we tested the sum. That seems to be working. I could also test it with different numbers, but I'm not going to bother doing that. Let's test to see if average is working. So let me enter some different numbers just for fun. I just pressed enter instead of entering number. Silly me. Average. Now, you'll notice that it says, I don't know how to calculate that. So once again, remember that error we had earlier where it was jumping there and saying, I don't know how to calculate that? Well, remember how we fixed that? We went through here. We looked at the condition that caused it to go here instead of here, which in that case was sum, and we realized that I wasn't comparing the strings correctly. Well, if you look here, I made the exact same mistake. So if I caught that earlier, then I wouldn't have to go through this process, but I purposely played dumb and did not change that earlier so that I could show you the process of going back and fixing that if you didn't catch the mistake earlier. So try it again. And you'll notice that the average is calculated at 6.4, and I'm going to assume that that's correct. Of course, I could check that with some values that I actually know. Like if I keep entering 1 and 2, then the average should be 1.5, right? Because that's right in between 1 and 2. And you'll notice that it does say 1.5. So it seems that our program works correctly. I could also try entering in some bogus value, as I said before. And for what should I calculate? I don't know how to spell bogus, evidently. There we go. It says I don't know how to calculate that. So yeah, there we debugged our first very basic program. In the next example I'm going to show, I'm going to debug a program that is more on an advanced level, and it's going to be a program that I wrote in Python. So stay tuned, come back for that, and I'll see you in the next example video.